Dawn, 25th of June 1944, hedgerow country northwest of Caen. The light came thin and pearly through ground mist, smelling of wet nettles, cordite ghosts from the night before, and churned clay. German infantry of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, shifted in their slit trenches by the WWII ridge, expecting the usual harassing fire, a few ranging shots, a curtain that would lift as quickly as it fell. Instead, the sky brightened with a flicker that wasn't sunlight. For a heartbeat, everything paused, the birds, the breeze, even breath, and then the world arrived all at once. In the span of a minute, the air filled with the freighted hiss of incoming, thousands of rounds converging from British and Canadian batteries that had been silent a moment earlier. Trails arced and wove like molten wire above the orchards. The first impacts peeled hedgerows open, flipped half-buried Panzer IVs onto their shoulders, and collapsed dugouts into suffocating wells of mud. Men felt the shock in their teeth. Field radios clattered uselessly as valves shattered. A junior NCO later remembered hands that wouldn't obey him, as if the blast had shaken command loose from the body. The fire had not been wild. It was computed. 25-pounder field regiments, 5.5-inch mediums, and heavy siege pieces had plotted their meteor, survey, and fuse settings so that shells from different guns and different ranges struck together. A time of arrival shoot the Allied manuals, called time on target. Instantaneous fuses scissored the hedges, delayed fuses punched beneath parapets, and lifted whole trench bays like doors. In less than 60 seconds, a defensive line ceased to exist as a coherent thing. Where platoons had been, there were only islands of men blinking in a rain of earth that looked like smoke. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if sound had been used up. Survivors crawled out with ringing ears and eyes streaming, unable to map where their positions had been. In that minute, they understood that the Allied guns were no longer merely weight but precision. Arithmetic turned into ruin. The next question for both sides was how such perfect concurrence had been built. The instruments, the survey lines, the drills, and the human routines that made numbers arrive as shock. By 1942, the Western Allies had learned a brutal truth that reshaped their doctrine. The side that mastered artillery, not tanks or aircraft, would dictate the tempo of modern war. The lesson had been carved into the deserts of North Africa and the mud of Italy, where German guns, precise, quick, and coordinated, had often blunted Allied assaults. Yet by mid-war, the British and Americans began to turn mathematics into a weapon. The British 25-pounder field gun, firing a 25-pound, 11.3-kilo shell up to 13,400 yards, became the core of an integrated system of observation, plotting, and synchronization. Its value lay not only in its range or rate of fire, 6 to 8 rounds a minute, but in the methodical precision of those who served it. Each gun was part of a network that thought in seconds, meters, and tables of logarithms. The Royal Artillery's fire control tables and gun drill number 7 allowed entire regiments to shift fire from one grid to another in moments, guided by calculated bearings rather than guesswork. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army's 105mm howitzer fulfilled a similar role. Lighter and more mobile, supporting infantry with remarkable flexibility. The Americans pioneered forward observation protocols that allowed every platoon to call fire by radio. A revolutionary step that turned individual riflemen into extensions of the artillery arm. Radar ranging, flash spotting, and acoustic detection refined the art still further. British counter-battery officers triangulated the crack of enemy guns with arrays of microphones, while radar sets like the SCR-584 tracked shells in flight, adjusting trajectories almost in real time. What once required intuition was now governed by physics. The Germans still relied on experience, map sketches and pre-sighted coordinates, deadly in static defense, but too rigid for the fast-shifting battlefields that were coming. They lacked the logistical architecture, communications density, and mathematical culture that made Allied artillery a machine of synchronized destruction. By the spring of 1944, British and Canadian gunners rehearsed vast fire plans, timed so that hundreds of guns across miles of front would unleash shells arriving within a second of one another. It was the marriage of mass and precision, an orchestra tuned not to music but to annihilation. When these doctrines met on the fields of Normandy, They would produce something the world had never seen before, a bombardment so concentrated that a single minute could erase an army. The science of time on target, known simply as TOT, was born from a single, ruthless idea that shock, not duration, was the essence of destruction. The old method of bombardment, with its rumbling crescendos and warning shrieks, gave soldiers seconds to react, to dive into foxholes or brace behind sandbags. TOT erased that mercy. Its principle was chillingly elegant. Instead of firing all guns at once, Allied gunnery officers calculated the flight time of every shell, down to fractions of a second. A 25-pounder shell fired from 8,000 yards might take 21 seconds to reach the target. A heavy 7.2-inch howitzer round from 14,000 yards might take 37. Therefore, the distant gun would fire 16 seconds earlier. Dozens, even hundreds of guns across the countryside, each with different ranges, muzzle velocities and elevations, would all time their shots so that every shell landed at precisely the same instant. Behind that simple outcome lay a labyrinth of arithmetic. Fire direction centers used range tables, meteorological corrections, and the gunner's most trusted instrument, the handheld slide rule. Barometric pressure, air temperature, and propellant charge each affected shell flight. Every detail was accounted for. British gunnery manuals contained pages of firing tables, produced by the Ordnance Survey and Ballistics Research Laboratory, allowing officers to compute flight times with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Watches were synchronized using radio time signals transmitted from headquarters, and even field units carried chronometers checked against zero-hour beacons. When orders came, fire TOT -16, each battery obeyed like clockwork. The result was devastation without prelude. For the German soldiers at Caen, there was no rising thunder, no scattered reports of approaching fire. One instant the air was quiet. The next it was filled with supersonic shrieks and white light. Trenches imploded before shouts could form. Observation posts vanished in simultaneous impacts, their operators buried, still holding binoculars. Within 60 seconds, every target grid the Allies had plotted dissolved under the mathematics of annihilation. The system turned artillery from a hammer that pounded over minutes into a scalpel that struck in a heartbeat. From Normandy onward, the sound of silence before a barrage would become more terrifying than the roar itself. Dawn broke cold and pale on June 25, 1944, as mist clung low over the rolling wheat fields west of Caen. The British Second Army, under Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, stood ready to launch Operation Epsom, an audacious attempt to cross the Odon River and envelop Caen from the west. For the men of 8 Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, the signal came at precisely 0700 hours. In an instant, the quiet Normandy countryside dissolved beneath the fury of more than 700 guns. From 25-pounders of the Royal Artillery to 7.2-inch howitzers and naval monitors offshore, every weapon joined a symphony of calculated chaos. Over 3,000 shells screamed down each minute along a front barely 4 miles wide, transforming pastures and orchards into quaking seas of fire and iron. The men advancing behind this storm, infantry of the 15th Scottish Division, could feel the shockwaves travel through their boots. Tank crews inside Sherman hulls, even with engines roaring, were deafened by the overpressure. One crewman later recalled that the air itself felt solid. The gunners had perfected the creeping barrage, a moving wall of explosions that inched forward in precise increments, 100 yards every 2 minutes, so the Scots could follow it like a curtain of thunder. German defenders from the 12th SS Panzer and 21st Panzer Divisions had no such luxury. Their communications trenches vanished before messages could be sent, and gun pits turned into shallow graves. Observation posts were swallowed whole. At several positions near Granville-sur-Odon, forward platoons were found afterward, still crouched in formation, killed by concussion before they ever saw an enemy. To witnesses, it seemed as if the earth had liquefied. The artillery had done what tanks and bombers could not: breach a fortified line without direct assault. By the time the smoke lifted, the first great demonstration of synchronized firepower had achieved the impossible: a clean rupture in the German defense west of Caen. Yet Epsom was only the prelude. The Allies had proven that mathematics could break armies, Now they would refine it until it became unstoppable. The storm that began over Caen would soon roll across all of Europe. To the men of the Wehrmacht dug in around Caen and Saint-Lô, the new Allied barrages did not feel like warfare. They felt like weather gone mad. The word that crept through German reports was Donnerwalzer, thunder roller, a description borrowed from storms, not strategy. It began without warning, without the distant rumble that once gave seconds of grace. One moment, there was the soft hum of wind across the hedgerows. The next, the world simply ceased to exist. Survivors spoke of air being ripped from their lungs, of pressure so immense it crushed the chest before sound could follow. Men clawed at the dirt in panic, trying to breathe through soil as collapsing parapets buried them alive. Those who endured the first salvo stumbled from their foxholes deaf, disoriented, and convinced the sky itself had turned against them. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel toured the front days later, he found not disciplined cohesion but hollow-eyed silence. Units that had once fought to the last round now trembled at the mere mention of incoming fire. His staff noted his grim observation. No army can withstand this forever. At first, German intelligence officers suspected the Allies had developed a new explosive, some kind of supershell or chemical propellant capable of generating the immense pressure waves that shredded bunkers. But the truth was more demoralizing. There was no miracle weapon, only method. Allied artillery's advantage lay in mathematics, logistics, and coordination. The invisible infrastructure of war that Germany, stretched and fractured, could no longer match. Morale collapsed faster than the casualty reports suggested. Prisoner interrogations recorded men refusing to reoccupy positions, describing every quiet moment as the pause before the next skyfall. Commanders began spacing out defensive lines, digging deeper shelters, even retreating from likely target zones at dusk. But no tactical adjustment could undo the psychological wound. From Normandy onward, fear of Allied artillery dictated every German movement. The battlefield had changed. Survival now depended not on courage, but on avoiding the soundless storm that struck without warning. Every thunderclap over Normandy was paid for months in advance, in ore mines. Machine shops and assembly lines scattered across 3 continents. Behind each 60-second bombardment stood an empire of logistics so vast that it blurred the line between battlefield and factory floor. By 1944, American industry had reached an output unmatched in history. More than 200 million artillery shells in a single year, from 105mm howitzers to the giant 155mm long toms. The British Ministry of Supply, meanwhile, coordinated over 400 factories, producing ammunition for the 25-pounder gun alone. Brass casings rolled from Birmingham, explosive fillings came from Wales, and fuses were assembled by the thousands in hidden workshops, staffed largely by women. Across the Atlantic, Canada's Dominion arsenals and U.S. plants in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Michigan fed the Atlantic convoys that delivered an uninterrupted stream of steel and fire to the front. For the planners, firepower was an equation. Each time-on-target strike required thousands of tons of material, fuel for the lorries, fresh barrels for guns that warped under the heat, and precise stocks of shells for every caliber. A single corps-level fire plan could consume over 20,000 rounds in an hour. To keep the rhythm unbroken, Royal Artillery command posts tracked usage with slide rules and logarithmic charts, predicting the next resupply not by guesswork, but by mathematical certainty. Railheads in Normandy became arteries of war, with trains timed to deliver ammunition columns within hours of expenditure. The Wehrmacht could not compete with such abundance. By mid-1944, German divisions in France were rationed to fewer than 50 shells per gun per day, crippled by shortages of copper and propellant. The imbalance turned every battle into an industrial calculation. One Allied minute of sustained fire equaled the weekly output of entire German munitions plants. As summer deepened, this relentless arithmetic dictated the campaign's outcome. The Allies had turned war into an industry, an engine where numbers, not generals, decided victory. The storm over Caen was only its first demonstration. At dawn on July 25, 1944, the hedgerows west of Saint-Lô trembled under a stillness that felt unnatural. For weeks, the American First Army had been locked in brutal stalemate, hemmed in by the Bocage and the stubborn remnants of the German 352nd and 2nd Panzer Divisions. Now, as part of Operation Cobra, that deadlock was about to shatter. At precisely 0940 hours, 1,500 US guns of 7 Corps opened fire in the most concentrated artillery strike ever executed by the American Army up to that point. The barrage lasted just 15 minutes, but in that span, more than 170,000 shells tore across a 6-mile front, an iron hurricane timed to land within seconds of one another. From 105mm howitzers to 8-inch guns, every piece was synchronized by radio time signals and stopwatch precision. Distant batteries fired first, closer ones fired last, ensuring that the entire torrent arrived together without the faintest warning to those below. The result defied comprehension. German trenches simply disappeared. The concussion liquefied the soil, turning meadows into pools of mud that swallowed bodies and vehicles alike. The air pressure was so intense that men were hurled from their cover as though struck by invisible waves. One American forward observer wrote that the ground jumped like it was alive. Within minutes, communications were gone, unit boundaries erased, and entire regiments ceased to exist. Those who survived described the blast as a wall of sound that never seemed to end, punctuated by the shriek of shells that arrived faster than thought. When the guns finally fell silent, the sky darkened again, this time with the shadow of 1,500 Allied bombers. Their ordnance finished what the artillery had begun. In that apocalyptic morning, the German front west of St. Lo collapsed. Patton's Third Army surged through the gap, and France's liberation began to move at the speed of steel. What had started as theory at Caen now proved itself in blood at St. Lo. Artillery had become the spearhead of modern war, a machine that thought, calculated, and killed in perfect unison. They were the unseen half of the battlefield, the men who killed by numbers. Allied artillery gunners lived in a world of angles, elevation, and charge. Working in teams of 6 to 10, they loaded, sighted, and fired with a rhythm closer to factory work than combat. Each gun crew was its own machine. One man handled the breech, another set the fuse, another recorded every correction in grease pencil on a metal plate darkened by powder smoke. Orders came in clipped coordinates, no faces, no cries, just grid references. When the command "fire" sounded, hundreds of men across miles of countryside moved in perfect sequence, their motions timed to the heartbeat of mathematics. Far ahead of them, often unseen and forgotten, crouched the forward observers, the eyes of the guns. Perched in church towers, hidden in barns or buried in foxholes barely large enough to turn in, they adjusted fire while tracer rounds and sniper bullets sliced the air around them. Their radios were lifelines, their maps the difference between precision and catastrophe. Many later admitted that each transmission carried a private weight, knowing that one misread coordinate could obliterate a farmhouse, a village, or their own comrades advancing beyond the next hedgerow. The Germans who endured these bombardments described them as the work of invisible giants. Prisoners captured after Operation Epsom and Cobra appeared hollow-eyed and speechless, muttering of hands from the sky that crushed the earth. But the toll was not one-sided. Allied gunners, too, felt the distance from what they destroyed. Some spoke of the silence that followed, the numb realization that they had never seen the men they killed. A British officer near Caen summarized the paradox simply, "Better our guns than our boys." In that cold calculus lay both mercy and horror, the proof that modern war had made empathy itself a weapon, and that the deadliest force on earth could still be guided by human conscience. The minute of fire at Caen had proven the concept. What followed was refinement to the point of art. The British called it the creeping barrage, a wall of explosions that inched across the battlefield with mathematical grace. First used amid the mud of the Somme, it returned in 1944 as a weapon of exact geometry. Fire planners charted every lift and pause, calculating advances in 100-yard increments, every 2 minutes, so that infantry could follow so closely behind the falling shells that they seemed to walk through the fire itself. It was warfare conducted by stopwatch and slide rule. To stand under its protection was to hear destruction moving forward like a living thing, a rolling tide of percussion that never stopped long enough for the enemy to recover. In early 1945, during Operation Veritable on the German frontier, this technique reached its peak. Over 1,050 guns of the British XXX Corps fired continuously for more than 5 hours as troops advanced through the Reichswald. Each battery lifted its fire exactly on cue, while engineers marked progress with colored smoke shells so infantry and gunners could remain in sync through fog and snow. German defenders described it as a Wand aus Stahl, a wall of steel, grinding across the earth with the rhythm of machinery. Those who survived spoke of ground that rippled like water, of the sky glowing red for miles. The Americans learned quickly. In the Hitlerjugend forest, they adapted the same timing principles but added a new dimension, the proximity fuse. These shells burst in mid-air, raining fragments through the trees and turning cover into death traps. No bunker or branch could shield against the invisible ceiling of fire. What had begun as brute bombardment evolved into orchestration, an exact choreography of destruction that could open corridors through cities, woods, or riverbanks with equal ease. From Caen to the Rhine, every offensive became a question of seconds, not courage. The age of guesswork had ended. War now moved to the tick of a clock. By the final months of 1944, artillery, not armor or air power, had become the defining instrument of Allied supremacy in Western Europe. Tanks might have captured the headlines, but it was gunnery that shaped the battlefield and decided its fate. From the Falaise pocket to the crossings of the Rhine, every major victory began with synchronized fire that left the enemy stunned before the first infantryman moved forward. German officers captured after the campaign testified bitterly that their counterattacks failed not through lack of courage, but through instant disintegration under the opening barrages. What had once been duels of maneuver were now contests of computation. The side that could calculate faster, coordinate wider, and sustain longer ruled the field. The psychological toll was as decisive as the physical. Allied map fire, strikes delivered entirely from grid coordinates without a single observer in sight, meant that German troops could die from mathematics alone. Infantry companies refused to move during daylight, convinced that unseen eyes watched from the clouds. With the Luftwaffe crippled, German artillery lost its spotters and fired blind, while Allied guns worked with an ecosystem of radar, reconnaissance aircraft, and forward control posts that transformed the entire Western Front into a live firing table. Reports from the Falaise sector told of battalions annihilated before they even reached assembly points, their destruction plotted miles away by unseen men with slide rules and telephones. What had begun as tactical innovation became strategic dominance. The one-minute barrage near Caen had been more than a feat of gunnery. It was a glimpse of the future. In this new form of war, precision replaced valor, and equations conquered willpower. When General Eisenhower later remarked that artillery won the Battle of Normandy, he was not offering metaphor but measurement. The age of steel and smoke had yielded to one of geometry and calculation, an era in which the mind, not the muscle, decided empires. For all its perfection, the new artillery science was never infallible. The same precision that made it unstoppable also made it perilous. Every calculation, every second, every digit on a map carried the weight of human lives. During Operation Cobra, that precision slipped. A single misalignment of coordinates and mistimed signals caused American bombers to release their payloads too soon. Hundreds of U.S. soldiers were killed or wounded by their own side before the first German gun answered. It was a grim reminder that mathematical warfare depended on flawless execution, and that chaos was always waiting at the edges of control. Even on the ground, the system strained under its own complexity. Each major bombardment consumed thousands of tons of shells and barrels of propellant, clogging roads and railways, already struggling to feed advancing armies. Weather turned roads to sludge, cutting resupply convoys. Moisture warped paper maps, blurring grid lines into guesswork. When radios failed or telephone wires were severed by shell fire, carefully synchronized barrages could collapse into confusion, leaving exposed infantry stranded in the gap between safety and annihilation. The Germans adapted swiftly. Camouflage nets, decoy positions, and the deliberate scattering of guns made targeting harder. Counter-battery radars, early models of what would become a post-war standard, began detecting incoming fire and triangulating its origin. In response, the Allies deployed systems like the SCR-584 radar and improved sound-ranging equipment, creating a duel of mathematics fought at the speed of electrons. By war's end, these lessons hardened into doctrine. Firepower could win battles, but only discipline and control could sustain victory. The minute of fire that had shattered Caen remained both a triumph and a warning. A vision of what happened when calculation ruled combat, and of how easily perfection could dissolve into catastrophe. From the ruined fields of Normandy emerged not just victory, but the first blueprint of modern precision warfare. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, their echoes carried into a new age. The lessons of Normandy did not fade with the peace. They became the foundation of an entire science. The time-on-target principle, born from the mud and blood of Caen, was codified into the post-war doctrines of every major army. NATO's formation in 1949 turned those battlefield improvisations into standardized mathematics, shared firing tables, uniform calibration charts, and synchronized communication protocols that linked artillery units across nations. What had once required slide rules and shouted orders was now executed by radio networks and soon after, early computers. The age of manual calculation had evolved into an era of digital precision. The influence reached far beyond doctrine. Post-war engineers designed self-propelled guns like the American M109 and British FV433 Abbott to embody mobility and coordination, artillery that could move, fire and reposition within minutes. Radar-guided fire control systems and analog computing machines, direct descendants of the SCR-584 and the wartime fire control tables, became the beating heart of Cold War arsenals. Even the concept of tactical nuclear artillery, shells, fired not to destroy trenches but to erase map grids, owed its lineage to the synchronization that had begun with time on target. For the former enemies, the revelation was sobering. Captured German officers studying Allied fire plans after the war marveled not at the weaponry, but at the organization behind it. They fought with mathematics, one observed. The storm that had rolled over Caen had done more than breach a defensive line. It had reshaped how wars would be fought. In that 1 minute of orchestrated fire lay the blueprint for all that followed. Warfare by algorithm, where intellect guided destruction with mechanical grace. The gunners of Normandy had unknowingly invented the mathematics of modern war. The fields west of Caen are quiet now. The hedgerows bloom again. The wheat sways where once it burned, and the air carries only the hum of wind and distant tractors. Yet beneath that calm earth lie the remnants of a single minute that once defied imagination, the shattered steel of shells, the splintered timber of gun emplacements, the fused soil of craters that once boiled like liquid. On that June morning in 1944, in the space of 60 seconds, the very laws of battle were rewritten. For those who endured it, German or Allied, it was not a fight but a force of nature, a moment when the ground itself breathed fire and the sky answered back. That thunder minute marked a turning point in the history of war. It was the instant when courage yielded to coordination, when destruction became an act of geometry. The artillery that once guarded trenches now ruled continents. Its reach measured not in yards but in equations. Every shell that has fallen since, whether in Korea, the Gulf, or beyond, has carried within it the echo of that synchronized storm over Normandy. The thunder has long faded, but its rhythm endures. Beneath the quiet fields near Caen lies the seed of modern warfare, the moment when time itself became a weapon and human intellect learned to command the fury of the earth. The silence that follows still belongs to that single, unforgettable minute.